For decades, the world has celebrated the Beatles as the greatest band in history. But behind the music was a story far more complicated, a tale that Hollywood skips. Paul McCartney and George Harrison were more than bandmates. They were friends, brothers, and sometimes bitter rivals. Their bond carried moments of fierce loyalty, but also years of cold silence and painful conflict. And when George's life was tragically cut short, Paul was left wrestling with memories of both harmony and profound regret. Today, the raw, unvarnished truth of that relationship finally comes into sharp focus. Paul McCartney and George Harrison's friendship began long before Beatlemania consumed the world. Their first connection was forged in 1954 when both boys attended the Liverpool Institute High School for Boys. Paul was a year ahead of George, already carving out a reputation for himself as bright, witty, and deeply musically inclined. George, on the other hand, was younger, quieter, and often described as a boy desperately trying to find his place in a rigid school environment that he utterly loathed. They didn't bond over academics. In fact, George admitted years later that the Institute was the worst time of my life. Instead, their true friendship blossomed on the long, routine bus rides into town, where the strict rules of school uniforms and class divisions happily melted away. On those crucial bus journeys, George keenly noticed Paul carrying his guitar, and conversation soon shifted from mundane schoolwork to the electric world of music. Both were captivated by the rising skiffle craze sweeping Britain at the time, a rough, homemade style that made young people truly believe they could form bands of their own. They shared a visceral admiration for American stars like Elvis Presley, Little Richard, and Buddy Holly. George, in particular, was captivated by the raw, haunting sound of Heartbreak Hotel when he first heard it drifting out of a house in Liverpool. He spent hours at home sketching guitars in his school notebooks and practicing simple chords until his fingertips were literally raw. Paul, whose father Jim McCartney had been a local jazz band leader in the 1920s, grew up surrounded by music, learning piano and then guitar. He quickly recognized George's unwavering dedication, and while their age difference might have seemed like a barrier, music obliterated it. By 1956, George had formed a small skiffle group called the Rebels with his brother Peter and a friend, clearly showing his determination to make music more than just a hobby. By 1957, Paul had joined John Lennon's band, the Quarrymen, and when the group began looking for another guitarist, Paul immediately and enthusiastically thought of George. Lennon, however, was stubbornly skeptical, openly feeling that George was simply too young and too baby-faced. The definitive turning point came one evening on the top deck of a Liverpool bus. George famously auditioned for John right then and there by playing a note-perfect, blistering version of Bill Justice's rockabilly instrumental, Raunchy. Lennon couldn't argue with that undeniable level of skill, and George was finally invited into the group. With George on board, the powerful nucleus of the Beatles was effectively complete. The trio of Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison began spending countless hours together, relentlessly teaching one another new chords, writing fragments of revolutionary songs, and daring to imagine a future beyond the gloomy streets of Liverpool. For Paul, who had already lost his mother to cancer at age 14, the friendship offered both deep companionship and urgent purpose. For George, it was the ultimate validation he craved, that he belonged among older, more experienced players. This early period cemented Paul's initial role as George's early mentor and tireless champion, but it also tragically set the stage for a relationship that, while rooted in brotherhood, would later violently struggle under the crushing pressure of ambition, egos, and unimaginable fame. As the Beatles rose from smoky Liverpool clubs to global blinding stardom in the early 1960s, the relationship between Paul McCartney and George Harrison grew relentlessly more complicated. By 1966, the group was no longer just a band of friends happily experimenting with music. It was the most famous act in the world, and with that fame came immense fracturing pressure. Paul had gradually stepped fully into the role of the band's relentless, driving creative force. He thrived in the chaotic studio environment, constantly pushing for innovation, orchestrating intricate arrangements, and aggressively demanding perfection. For George, however, this growing dominance felt undeniably suffocating. The difference was painfully clear in the making of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967. The project was overwhelmingly Paul's vision, a complex record that would fundamentally redefine rock music. But for George, it acutely highlighted how little space was left for his own musical ideas. His one significant contribution, Within You Without You, reflected his deep immersion in Indian philosophy and spiritual music, but it deliberately stood apart from the rest of the album. To Paul, it was just another track in a conceptual album. To George, it was a profoundly personal statement. Their contrasting priorities violently came to the surface during the Beatles' famed trip to India in 1968. George saw meditation and spirituality as life-changing, fundamental truths, while Paul treated it as little more than a colorful diversion from the essential music. Paul later recalled jokingly with George, "Calm down, Georgie boy. Sense of humor needed here." But to Harrison, this was absolutely no laughing matter. For him, the Beatles' increasing obsession with records and business was a tragic distraction from the spiritual path he believed was absolutely essential. This clash of priorities violently set the tone for what followed. As Paul grew more determined to single-handedly lead the group's direction, George became increasingly frustrated at being perpetually sidelined. For years, his songs were routinely seen as secondary to the Lennon-McCartney catalog. But by the end of the decade, George was no longer content with being in the shadows, and Paul's damaging inability to truly recognize that would come at a staggering cost. By 1969, the Beatles were no longer the tight-knit band of brothers they had once been. Recording sessions for Let It Be revealed just how strained things had become. Cameras famously captured the agonizing tension, with Paul McCartney frequently and bluntly directing the others, often to the immediate irritation of George Harrison. At one volcanic point, George finally snapped back at Paul's controlling instructions. "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if you don't want me to. Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it." It was a biting, sarcastic moment that exposed years of pent-up frustration. George had grown into a brilliant, confident songwriter, but Paul's suffocating, controlling approach left little room for him to creatively breathe. Harrison had quietly amassed a stunning catalog of material, songs like All Things Must Pass, Isn't It a Pity, and Run of the Mill. Yet many of them were cruelly pushed aside during critical Beatles sessions. Paul, alongside John, continued to relentlessly dominate the releases, while George's magnificent compositions often remained tragically unheard. On January 10, 1969, George finally had enough. In the middle of rehearsals, he dramatically walked out, later recalling that it was very unhealthy and unhappy for him to stay. While John Lennon had often spoken of quitting before, George's quiet, decisive departure sent true shockwaves through the group. The others frantically scrambled to bring him back, finally realizing how utterly essential he was, not only as an innovative guitarist, but as a vital part of the fragile balance that truly held the Beatles together. George did return 12 days later, but the cracks were now permanent. His raw song, Wah Wah, written on the very day he quit, perfectly reflected his deep feelings about the suffocating environment Paul had helped create. Later that year, in a private conversation captured by writer Anthony Fawcett, Paul actually admitted to John that, "Until now our songs have been better than George's. Now this year, his songs are at least as good as ours." George instantly dismissed this as a damaging myth, angrily insisting he had been writing those great songs for years. The resentment was glaringly clear. Paul saw George as a late bloomer, while George saw Paul as a territorial tyrant unwilling to share space. It was during this period that George's frustrations hardened into brilliant music. On his landmark solo album, All Things Must Pass, in 1970, the track Run of the Mill contained lines directly aimed at Paul. "You've got me wondering how I lost your friendship." The friendship was deeply wounded, and though they would remain forever bound by history, the scars of 1969 would never fully heal. Although the atmosphere in the band was toxic, 1969 also brought George Harrison his long-overdue, spectacular recognition. When the Beatles recorded Abbey Road, it was Harrison who delivered two of the undeniable standout tracks, Here Comes the Sun and Something. Frank Sinatra would later famously call Something the greatest love song ever written, while John Lennon himself grudgingly admitted it was the best track on the album. For George, this was ultimate vindication after years of being systematically overlooked. For Paul, however, it was a sudden, sharp reminder that the balance of power in the Beatles was rapidly shifting. Behind the scenes, tensions remained dangerously high. George openly resented Paul's constant, overbearing interference with arrangements. While Paul often believed George lacked the necessary discipline to refine his powerful ideas, their relationship during the Abbey Road sessions was strictly professional, but far from warm. The music, thankfully, spoke louder than their brittle conversations, and by the time the album was released in September 1969, the Beatles were already irreversibly unraveling. The breakup became official the following year. George quickly moved forward with his solo career, immediately releasing All Things Must Pass in late 1970, a legendary triple album that stunned the world with its overwhelming depth and maturity. Meanwhile, Paul released McCartney, marking the start of his powerful journey as a solo artist and eventually with Wings. The intense rivalry lingered, each man aggressively carving his own path, each proving he could powerfully succeed without the Beatles. Their interactions in the 1970s were sporadic and often cold. In interviews, George openly admitted he found Paul overpowering, and once cuttingly remarked that he would happily play in a band with John Lennon again, but not with Paul. For his part, Paul seemed to shrug it off publicly, but privately, the sting of those words clearly lingered. Despite the deep tension, there were small, fragile moments of reconciliation. In 1971, George invited Paul to perform at the legendary Concert for Bangladesh, but Paul declined, citing understandable concerns about the logistics. The absence only widened the rift. As the years relentlessly rolled on, the relationship between the two men seemed defined less by brotherly friendship and more by unresolved grievances, with George focusing on spirituality and meaningful solo projects, while Paul relentlessly pursued massive commercial success. Yet no matter how fractured things appeared, there remained an invisible thread between them, a crucial shared history that neither could escape, even in bitterness. That thread would eventually pull them back together again decades later, though not without new disagreements of its own. By the early 1990s, time had mercifully softened some of the lingering anger, and circumstance powerfully brought Paul McCartney and George Harrison back together. On February 11, 1994, George, Paul, and Ringo quietly reunited at McCartney's studio to work on unfinished John Lennon demos. The press instantly called them the Threedles, and for millions of fans, it felt like a miraculous resurrection of something thought lost forever. But beneath the excitement, the old, dangerous dynamics quickly resurfaced. George arrived at the sessions with firm, non-negotiable opinions. He insisted that his friend Jeff Lynne produce the tracks, pointedly warning Paul that without an outside hand, the entire project could quickly dissolve into total chaos. Paul later admitted it was George who said, "No, we need a producer. It could be dangerous just to all get in the studio. Could get nasty. You've got egos flying around." Even then, George's words carried the heavy weight of their shared, turbulent history. The collaboration famously produced the songs Free as a Bird and Real Love, But even in that process, George and Paul inevitably clashed. McCartney wanted the songs to sound quintessentially Beatles, while Harrison leaned strongly toward simplicity and his own melodic, distinct instincts. They disagreed on solos, lyrics, even the very spirit of what the reunion should be. Yet somehow the work got done, and the songs ultimately became a necessary bridge back to their past. Outside the studio, their personal bond was fragile, but incredibly enduring. George rarely masked his feelings. He once admitted he couldn't imagine being in another band with Paul, again describing him as overpowering. Paul, meanwhile, began to publicly and finally acknowledge what he had so completely failed to see in the 1960s, George's unarguable genius as a songwriter. In interviews, he admitted he underestimated his younger bandmate, calling him a late bloomer, who ultimately wrote some of the greatest songs ever. As the decade closed, George's health began to tragically falter. A throat cancer diagnosis in 1997, followed by treatment for lung cancer and later a brain tumor, forced him into a quieter, more reflective life. In 1999, he miraculously survived a violent knife attack at his home in Friar Park, leaving him physically weakened but spiritually resolute. Paul visited when he could, and despite all their bitter past quarrels, the connection between them deepened and softened as George's time grew short. On November 29, 2001, George Harrison lost his battle with cancer. He was just 58 years old, a lifelong smoker whose final years had been marked by relentless illness and physical decline. His ashes were cremated and scattered in the sacred waters of the Ganges and Yamuna rivers in accordance with his profound Hindu beliefs. For Paul McCartney, the loss was absolutely devastating, not just the passing of a legendary bandmate, but the death of someone he had intimately known since boyhood. In a 2008 interview, Paul vividly recalled one of their final meetings in a New York hospital. He sat by George's side for hours, and the two affectionately joked about nutty stuff, as if they were kids again. Paul described it as, like we were dreaming. At one point, they even held hands, something that would have seemed completely unthinkable in their younger years when Liverpool lads avoided such public displays of affection. "He was my little baby brother," Paul said, his voice cracking with raw emotion. The man he once underestimated, clashed with, and even resented had always, fundamentally, been family. The day after George's death, Paul faced reporters, struggling visibly for words. "He was a lovely man and a very brave man," he said. "I think he'll be remembered as a great man in his own right." In the years that followed, Paul found beautiful, touching ways to keep George close. He often speaks of a tree George had given him, a fir tree planted near the gate of his home. Every time he passes it, Paul whispers, "Hi, George." For him, the tree is more than a gift. It is George living on. Rooted firmly in the earth, still growing. Even their children powerfully carry on the bond. George's son, Donnie, and Paul's daughter, Stella, remain close friends, supporting one another in their respective careers and lives. It is as if the next generation gracefully inherited not the bitter rivalry, but the unbreakable brotherhood that lay beneath it all. For all the years of ugly conflict and cold silence, Paul McCartney never stopped seeing George Harrison as family. Their story is one of childhood friendship, fiery rivalry, devastating loss, and an unbreakable bond that even death could not erase. What's your favorite George Harrison song? And do you think Paul was right when he said George's best work could truly stand alongside his and John's? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more untold stories from music history.